On the 29th of April 1945, a young man from Philadelphia stood before the gates of Buchenwald. Private First Class Leon Bass was 21 years old. What he witnessed that day would alter his understanding of the world entirely. Bass served with the 183rd Engineer Combat Battalion, an all-black unit that had fought across Europe since Normandy. The army had assigned them to support the liberation effort. What confronted him that morning, skeletal figures, crematoria, the methodical machinery of genocide, prompted a profound realization. Throughout his life, white Americans had insisted that black people were inferior, subhuman, dangerous. Now he stood amidst the ruins of a place built by white people who had convinced themselves that certain humans weren't human at all. Before we go on, if you enjoy these untold stories from history, do consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. The United States Army in 1945 remained entirely segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks. They had fought through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany, always apart from their white counterparts. The army maintained this was necessary, that integration would prove problematic. Army pamphlets distributed to black troops before they entered Germany carried explicit warnings. German civilians, indoctrinated by 12 years of Nazi propaganda, would view them as inferior. They should expect hostility, rejection. They were advised to keep their distance. What the army failed to mention was that Nazi propaganda had been rather more complicated than simple hostility. Whilst the regime had classified black people as racially inferior, many ordinary Germans had never actually encountered a black person. Their understanding derived entirely from propaganda, and that propaganda had been contradictory. Jesse Owens had won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Berlin Olympics whilst Hitler looked on. German audiences had watched American films featuring black performers. When black American soldiers began occupying German cities after the war, something quite unexpected occurred. The hostility the army had warned about simply failed to materialize. German civilians, particularly women, approached black soldiers with curiosity, friendliness, sometimes genuine warmth. The United States Army responded immediately. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, faced considerable pressure from Southern congressmen, horrified by reports of black soldiers socializing with white German women. The army issued orders restricting fraternization. Black soldiers received explicit warnings that relationships with German women would result in courts-martial. White military police began patrolling areas where black soldiers were stationed, searching for violations. The regulations revealed something the army preferred not to acknowledge. They weren't attempting to prevent fraternization with enemy civilians. They were specifically trying to prevent black soldiers from forming relationships with white women. White American soldiers faced no such restrictions. By summer 1945, the army confronted a public relations crisis. Southern newspapers ran headlines about black soldiers fraternizing with German women. Congressmen demanded investigations. White soldiers sent letters home describing black troops socializing freely with German civilians. Whilst they themselves faced resentment from Germans who viewed Americans as occupiers, the racial logic had twisted itself into knots. Black soldiers who had been told they would face the worst hostility were receiving the warmest welcome. White soldiers who had expected to be treated as liberators often encountered cold shoulders. Despite the regulations, relationships continued to form. In Stuttgart, a black supply sergeant named William Johnson met a German woman called Hildegard whilst distributing rations to civilian population centers. In Frankfurt, a military policeman named Robert Townsend began teaching English to German refugees at a displaced persons center, where he met Elizabeth, a former schoolteacher. In Munich, a combat engineer named Thomas Green helped repair a bombed church, where he encountered Maria, whose husband had perished on the Eastern Front. These weren't illicit affairs or willful violations of orders. They were human beings meeting in the aftermath of catastrophe, finding common ground in shared experiences of loss and survival. The army began conducting investigations. Black soldiers seen regularly with German women were summoned for questioning. Where had they met her? What was the nature of their relationship? Did they understand the regulations against fraternization? The interrogations were designed to intimidate, to remind black soldiers of their place. Something rather interesting occurred during these investigations, however. German women began defending the soldiers. When military police questioned Hildegard about her friendship with Sergeant Johnson, she stated plainly that he had been kind to her children, had helped repair her damaged flat, and that she would continue to welcome him. The army could court-martial soldiers. They possessed no authority over German civilians. By August 1945, something quite remarkable appeared in army reports. Black soldiers were receiving marriage proposals from German women. Not one or two isolated cases, but dozens. The Army Chaplain Corps found itself overwhelmed with requests for authorization to marry. Each request required approval from commanding officers, investigation of the German civilian's background, certification that she wasn't a Nazi party member, and verification that the soldier understood he was violating social norms. The marriage approval process could take 6 months to a year. Many couples proceeded with German civil ceremonies, which the army refused to recognize. The requests kept coming. If you're finding this fascinating, do hit subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories like this. Then came the backlash. In January 1946, the army issued General Order 97, officially banning marriage between occupation forces and German nationals. The order applied to all soldiers, but enforcement focused disproportionately on black troops. Sergeant William Johnson was court-martialed for a conduct unbecoming after military police discovered letters from Hildegard in his footlocker. He was reduced in rank and transferred to a Labour battalion. Private Robert Townsend was presented with a choice: end his relationship with Elizabeth immediately or face dishonourable discharge. The message was unmistakable. Black soldiers who had fought to defeat fascism in Europe remained subject to Jim Crow restrictions. To understand why this occurred, one must consider the Rhineland bastards. After the First World War, French occupation forces in the Rhineland included colonial troops from Senegal and Morocco. Some German women had relationships with these soldiers. Children were born. The Weimar Republic registered approximately 600 of these mixed-race children. When the Nazis came to power, they declared these children a threat to racial purity. In 1937, the Gestapo rounded up the Rhineland children. Most were teenagers by then, and forcibly sterilized them. Not imprisoned, not deported, sterilized. The Nazi obsession with preventing mixed-race reproduction was so intense they violated children's bodies to prevent future contamination. The reality in post-war Germany was collapse. By May 1945, German cities were rubble. Berlin was 70% destroyed. Hamburg 75%. Munich 50%. Infrastructure had ceased functioning. Water, electricity, food distribution had stopped. When American occupation forces arrived, they brought food, medicine, coal for heating. Black soldiers in supply units were often the first Americans that German civilians encountered. These weren't combat troops. They were logistics specialists, engineers, medics. They distributed rations, repaired water systems, established medical clinics. To German women attempting to keep their children alive through the winter of 1945 to 46, these soldiers weren't representatives of an inferior race. They were men with the power to help, and many chose to exercise that power with compassion. Black soldiers also faced unique disadvantages, however. The army assigned black units primarily to service roles: supply, transportation engineering, graves registration. Combat roles were largely reserved for white units. This wasn't because black soldiers lacked ability. It was deliberate policy based on racist assumptions. The irony was that this relegated status actually facilitated more civilian contact. Combat units moved frequently. Service units remained in place, worked alongside German civilians on reconstruction projects, developed ongoing relationships. The Army's racist assignment policies inadvertently created conditions for precisely the interracial contact the Army wished to prevent. By late 1946, disillusionment was spreading amongst black soldiers. They had fought to defeat a racist ideology in Europe. They had seen the concentration camps, witnessed what happened when governments declared certain humans subhuman. They had liberated Europe from fascism. Now they were being told they couldn't form relationships with white women because of their race. Corporal James Davis wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, one of America's leading black newspapers. We defeated Hitler's racism with guns. Now we face American racism with regulations. What did we fight for? The letter was published. The army investigated Davis for undermining morale. He was transferred to a supply depot in France and informed that speaking to the press without authorization was grounds for court-martial. For Sergeant William Johnson, the personal cost proved devastating. After his court-martial and reduction in rank, he was transferred away from Stuttgart and Hildegard. The army confiscated their correspondence. Johnson wasn't permitted to communicate with her. Hildegard didn't know where he had been sent. She wrote letters to the army requesting information about his location. The letters were filed away unanswered. Johnson spent months not knowing whether Hildegard believed he had abandoned her. An army psychiatrist diagnosed him with anxiety reaction and recommended rest. Johnson didn't require rest, however. He required permission to contact the woman he loved. Then something unexpected emerged from army records. A researcher studying post-war occupation policies discovered that German women married to black American soldiers reported lower rates of domestic violence than German women married to white American soldiers. Between 1945 and 1948, German authorities documented 847 cases of domestic violence involving American soldiers and German women. Of those, 89 involved black soldiers, approximately 10.5% of cases. Black soldiers represented 11% of American forces in Germany. White soldiers were overrepresented in domestic violence statistics. Black soldiers were underrepresented. The researcher published this finding in a sociology journal. The army never officially acknowledged the study, but it circulated amongst civil rights advocates as evidence that opposition to interracial relationships was based on prejudice, not protection. In July 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, mandating desegregation of the armed forces. The order didn't specifically address marriage restrictions, but it established a principle. Racial discrimination in military policy was no longer acceptable. The army began slowly processing marriage applications from black soldiers and German women that had been pending for years. Sergeant Johnson's application, filed in 1946, was finally approved in November 1948. By then, he hadn't seen Hildegard in over 2 years. He sent a telegram. The response came 3 weeks later. She was still waiting. She had never stopped waiting. They were married in Stuttgart in January 1949, 3.5 years after they met. A quick note, if this story has captured your attention, subscribing truly does help us continue this work. Now, back to our story. Success brought new problems, however. As marriages between black soldiers and German women became more common, American segregationists escalated their opposition. Southern congressmen introduced bills to ban military personnel from bringing foreign spouses to the United States if those marriages violated state anti-miscegenation laws. Some southern states refused to recognize marriages between black soldiers and white German women. When couples attempted to settle in states like Mississippi or Alabama, they faced legal harassment, housing discrimination, and employment barriers. Many couples chose to remain in Germany rather than face American racism. The winter of 1948 to 49 was brutally cold in Germany. Coal shortages meant many buildings had no heat. Food rationing continued. The Berlin blockade had begun in June 1948, escalating tensions between American and Soviet forces. Germany was becoming the front line of the Cold War. The uncertainty was compounded by practical challenges. Housing shortages meant married soldiers often couldn't find accommodation for their wives. Some couples lived in German civilian housing, separated from military support systems. Others lived in displaced persons camps. British occupation authorities maintained different policies than American forces. British Army regulations permitted marriage with German civilians, with command approval, without racial restrictions. French forces, which included colonial troops from Africa, also allowed interracial relationships. The different policies created tension amongst Allied occupation authorities. The real source of tension, however, was that British, French, and Soviet attitudes highlighted American racial hypocrisy. How could the United States claim moral leadership of the free world whilst maintaining segregated military forces and prohibiting interracial marriage? Soviet propaganda exploited this contradiction with considerable effectiveness. Corporal Robert Townsend adopted a different strategy. After the army presented him with the ultimatum, end his relationship with Elizabeth or face discharge, he chose discharge. In March 1947, Townsend requested early release from service. The army granted it immediately, perhaps hoping to make an example of him. Townsend remained in Germany as a civilian. He found work with the Civilian Occupation Administration, married Elizabeth in a German ceremony, and lived in Frankfurt. When other black soldiers learnt of this, some followed his example. The army considered this mass defiance. In 1948, Army intelligence estimated that approximately 200 former black soldiers had remained in Germany after discharge, specifically to be with German women. Support networks developed. German women married to black soldiers formed mutual aid groups. They shared information about navigating military bureaucracy, helped one another find housing, provided childcare support. Some German churches, particularly Catholic parishes that had opposed the Nazi regime, openly welcomed these couples. Pastor Friedrich Weber in Munich organized marriage preparation classes specifically for mixed couples, teaching them about both American and German law, preparing them for challenges they would face. This underground support system operated beneath the Army's official radar. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund developed a new legal strategy. They argued that military marriage restrictions violated soldiers' constitutional rights under the First and 14th Amendments. Marriage was a fundamental right. The Army couldn't restrict it based solely on race without compelling governmental interest. The Defense Fund filed a test case in 1948 on behalf of Sergeant David Coleman, who had been court-martialed for marrying a German woman without authorization. The Federal District Court ruled in the Army's favor, stating military necessity justified the restrictions. The Defense Fund appealed. Each soldier faced an individual calculation. Obey regulations, maintain military career, but lose the relationship. Or defy regulations, face court-martial or discharge, but remain with the woman you loved. Private Thomas Green told his commanding officer directly, "I fought fascism for 3 years. I'm not going to let racism tell me who I can love." Green faced court-martial, received a dishonorable discharge, and remained in Munich with Maria. Some couples attempted compromise solutions. Private James Wilson and his German fiancée Anna agreed he would return to the United States first, establish civilian life, then send for her to immigrate as his fiancée rather than as a military dependent. The plan seemed sound. Wilson received honorable discharge in June 1948, returned to Detroit, found employment at Ford Motor Company, and began the immigration sponsorship process. The wait was supposed to be 6 months. It took 3 years. When Aneda finally arrived in Detroit in 1951, they barely recognized one another. The reunion was awkward, strained. They married anyway, hoping proximity would restore what distance had eroded. By 1949, many relationships had failed. The combination of military regulations, bureaucratic delays, material hardship, and long-term separation had broken couples apart. The Army compiled statistics. Of approximately 3,200 marriage applications filed by black soldiers serving in Germany between 1945 and 1949, only 1,100 had been approved. Of those approved marriages, an estimated 40% ended in separation or divorce within 5 years. The Army used these statistics to justify their original restrictions. What the statistics failed to capture was how Army policies had actively sabotaged these relationships. This is when the story might have ended. Failed experiment. Proof that American segregation was justified. But something occurred that altered everything. In July 1949, The army discharged 150,000 soldiers as part of post-war demobilization. Amongst them were hundreds of black soldiers who had been serving in Germany. They faced a choice: return to the United States, to segregation, states where their marriages might not be recognized, or remain in Germany where they were accepted, where their relationships were normal, where their children wouldn't grow up under Jim Crow. A remarkable number chose to remain. By 1950, approximately 1,500 black American veterans were living permanently in Germany with German wives and families. They became a visible community. In Frankfurt, they established a social club. In Munich, they organized a mutual aid society. In Stuttgart, they created an English language school. These weren't isolated individuals any longer. They were an established community, recognized by German authorities, integrated into German society. German churches welcomed them. German employers hired them. German neighbors accepted them. The existence of this community disproved every argument about why these relationships couldn't function. Living in Germany as black Americans in the 1950s brought new risks, however. The Cold War was intensifying. Berlin was divided. American intelligence services were suspicious of Americans who chose to live in Europe permanently, particularly those who had rejected life in the United States. FBI files documented black veterans living in Germany as potential security risks. Some black veterans were questioned by US intelligence officers. Were they in contact with Soviet agents? Had they made statements critical of the United States? The men who had fought fascism were now suspected of communist sympathies simply because they lived abroad with German wives. The real test came in 1954. The Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown versus Board of Education, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. American journalists began writing stories about black GI families in Germany. Life magazine published a photo essay. The stories emphasized how German society had accepted these families, how children attended integrated schools without controversy. The articles didn't explicitly criticize American segregation, but the contrast was obvious. If Germany could integrate, why couldn't America? In 1955, when the Montgomery bus boycott began, Northern newspapers published comparison pieces. In Montgomery, black Americans were fighting for the right to sit where they wished on buses. In Germany, both black Americans and white Germans lived as equals. The families in Germany received both hate mail from American racists and thank you letters from activists who viewed them as proof that America's racial hierarchy wasn't natural or inevitable. Some families decided to return to America not because Germany had rejected them, but because America was changing. In 1957, Sergeant William Johnson and Hildegard moved to Philadelphia with their 3 children. The return proved difficult. Pennsylvania didn't have legal segregation like southern states, but discrimination was real. In 1958, Johnson was offered a better position in Virginia. The family moved to Richmond. Virginia was still enforcing anti-miscegenation laws. The state threatened to prosecute them for unlawful cohabitation. Their children's birth certificates were challenged. The Johnson family faced an impossible choice: leave Virginia or challenge the law in court. They chose to fight. With NAACP Legal Defense Fund support, they filed suit challenging Virginia's anti-miscegenation law as unconstitutional. The case moved through state courts slowly. Meanwhile, they lived under threat of prosecution. The Johnson family endured 3 years of legal limbo. During that time, they faced harassment, anonymous phone calls at night, threatening letters. Someone threw a brick through their window with a note attached: "Go back to Germany." Their children were bullied at school. Hildegard insisted on staying. She told a reporter, "We left Germany because we believed America was better. If we run away now, we prove the racists right. We stay and fight." Her determination was remarkable. A German woman who had experienced Nazi racism, then chose America and was now fighting American racism to make America live up to its own stated values. The case nearly collapsed. In 1961, the Virginia Supreme Court upheld the state's anti-miscegenation law. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund immediately appealed to the US Supreme Court. The Supreme Court accepted a different case challenging Virginia's anti-miscegenation law. Loving versus Virginia, filed by Richard and Mildred Loving, an interracial couple who had been arrested in 1958. The Supreme Court consolidated several anti-miscegenation challenges, including the Johnson case, to be heard together. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the sort of viewer we create these documentaries for. Please do subscribe. On the 12th of June 1967, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Loving versus Virginia. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the unanimous opinion. The court held that Virginia's anti-miscegenation law violated both the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Warren wrote that marriage is amongst the basic civil rights, fundamental to human existence and survival. The decision was unequivocal. Anti-miscegenation laws were unconstitutional. 16 states' laws were instantly invalidated. The Johnson family held a small celebration in their Richmond home. Hildegard wept not from sadness, but from relief. For 9 years since returning from Germany, they had lived under the threat of prosecution. Now the threat was gone. After the celebration ended, there was a strange quiet. The Johnsons sat in their living room that evening, not speaking much. The victory was real, but it couldn't erase the years of struggle. The Supreme Court decision meant their marriage was legal. It didn't mean their neighbors suddenly accepted them, but something fundamental had shifted. The law was now on their side. In the years following Loving versus Virginia, interracial marriage rates increased gradually. In 1967, approximately 3% of marriages were interracial. By 1980, that number had risen to 7%. By 2000, it was 15%. The families who had pioneered interracial marriage in the 1940s and 50s watched this change with complex emotions. They were vindicated, but they also knew how difficult their path had been. Historians began researching occupation-era relationships. Oral history projects interviewed couples who had met in post-war Germany. A pattern emerged. These relationships had succeeded despite institutional opposition, not because of institutional support. Sociologists studying these families discovered something unexpected. Children from these families showed higher rates of cross-cultural competence, foreign language fluency, and international perspective than children from monoracial families. The United States military never officially apologized for its discriminatory marriage policies, but institutional practices changed. By 1970, the military had abandoned race-specific marriage restrictions. In 1995, the Army published a historical study of race relations in the post-war occupation. The study acknowledged that marriage restrictions had been discriminatory and had damaged morale amongst black soldiers. It was bureaucratic language, carefully hedged, but it was acknowledgement. By the 2000s, military interracial marriage was common and unremarkable. Approximately 15% of military marriages were interracial, higher than the civilian rate of 12%. Military bases were amongst the most integrated spaces in American society. In 2017, 50 years after Loving versus Virginia, historians organized a symposium on interracial military families. William Johnson, then 93 years old, was invited to speak. He and Hildegard, 91, traveled to Washington for the event. Johnson recounted their story, meeting during the occupation, falling in love, facing the Army's opposition, enduring years of legal limbo, the harassment in Virginia, the vindication of the Loving decision. When he finished, Hildegard stood to speak. She said simply, "We just wanted to be us together. We didn't want to be symbols, but if our stubbornness helped other people, I'm glad." The audience stood and applauded for 5 minutes. The Johnson story is one of thousands. Thousands of black American soldiers who met German women in the aftermath of the Second World War. Thousands of couples who faced institutional opposition, social stigma, legal barriers. Some relationships didn't survive those pressures. Many did. Those couples, through their persistence, helped dismantle legal barriers to interracial marriage. This wasn't the conventional civil rights narrative of marches and protests. It was quieter, more personal. It was people choosing love over conformity, choosing human connection over institutional hierarchy. William Johnson died in 2019 at age 95. Hildegard followed 6 months later at 93. They had been married 70 years. At the funeral, their children spoke about their parents' determination, their refusal to accept that society could dictate whom they loved. Their grandchildren spoke about growing up with a German grandmother whose accent never faded, who taught them to speak German, who made Stollen at Christmas and told them stories about surviving the war. Their great-grandchildren represented something profound, a multiracial, multicultural family that existed only because two people in 1945 had met amidst the ruins of war and chosen one another. The story of Black American soldiers and German women in post-war Germany teaches us something essential about human connection and institutional power. Racism functions through institutions, laws, military regulations, social norms that enforce hierarchy and separation, but racism is ultimately a human creation. Humans can choose differently. The couples who defied military regulations and anti-miscegenation laws weren't heroes in the conventional sense. They were ordinary people who made a simple choice to be together regardless of institutional opposition. Their choice was radical precisely because it was ordinary. When we examine the 1940s and 50s, it's easy to perceive the racism clearly. Anti-miscegenation laws seem obviously unjust now. But in that era, they were defended by legislators, judges, religious leaders, citizens who believed racial separation was natural and necessary. The couples who defied those laws faced real consequences: lost employment, family rejection, legal prosecution, social ostracism. They persisted not knowing that future generations would view them as pioneers. They couldn't see 2025, couldn't know that interracial marriage would become common and legally protected. They acted on faith in their relationships. Faith that their choice was right despite what society proclaimed. That faith was validated by history. But they didn't possess history's validation when they required courage. They had only their commitment to one another. And somehow that was enough. This is the story they didn't teach you in school. The story of Black American soldiers who were told they'd be unwanted in Germany, who found acceptance instead. The story of German women who had been told Black people were inferior, who chose Black American soldiers as husbands anyway. The story of couples who faced down both Nazi racial ideology and American segregation. The story of families that existed as living proof that racial hierarchy was a lie. Their story is American history. It's civil rights history. It's military history. It's German history. It's human history. And the boundaries that divide us are never as strong as the connections that unite us.